Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Father Joe Matern. I'm the founder and director of the Casa Esther Catholic Worker House here in Umbro, Wisconsin. And we want to thank you for joining us for this Lenten series of roundtable discussions. The name of this series is Blessed Are the Peacemakers, a Lenten exploration of gospel nonviolence and why it matters. We are grateful that you have joined us, and we thank you as well as thanking our co-sponsors who have made this possible. Have a good Lent as we send you our blessings.
Blessed are the peacemakers, a Lenten exploration of gospel nonviolence and why it matters. Tonight's presentation is Jesus Through the Lens of Nonviolence by Father John Deere. My name is David Mueller, and I will be tonight's moderator. I'm a member of the Casa Esther Catholic Worker community, and some of you may know me as the coordinator of the Dorothy Day Canonization Prayer Network. Together with the campus ministry staff from Viterbo University, Loras College, St. Mary's University, and the University of Wisconsin Green Bay campus, we have been organizing this 7-week series since last September, and I want to thank the members of this planning committee. Besides the planning committee, I want to thank our other sponsoring schools, Dominican University and Calumet College of St. Joseph. And our sponsor organizations include Pax Christi USA and Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. Please consider joining and getting involved with one or both of these worthy organizations. Each weekly event will be moderated by different members from our planning committee and from our sponsoring organizations. In each event will consist of a 30-minute presentation followed by a Q&A session of about 20 minutes, and then we will break off for the groups that have signed up as groups to go back to their local discussions, and we may continue with Q&A if there are additional questions. Please submit your questions anytime during Father John's presentation. We will not have a public chat that you will see on the right side of your screen, so we will receive the questions and select the questions to present to Father John after his presentation. And we'll always begin each event with a prayer for peace. It's especially urgent at this time. We have the war going on in the Ukraine, which is yet another stark reminder that our world is dominated by a culture of death and violence. Let's begin our prayer with a moment of silence as we remember our suffering sisters and brothers in the Ukraine. Lord, lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth. Lead us from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Let peace fill our hearts, our world, and our universe. Let us dream together, pray together, and work together to build one world of peace and justice for all. Amen. All right, many of you already know Father John Deere. I'm going to summarize my introduction. He is an activist, a speaker, an author of 35 books. He has been nominated several times for the Nobel Peace Prize. He is the founder and director of the Beatitude Center for the Nonviolent Jesus. If you're interested in digging deeper into gospel nonviolence, I highly recommend going to his website, beatitudecenter.org, where you can listen to podcasts of Father John, and please consider registering for the scheduled events, which consist of discussions with contemporary leaders in the peace and nonviolence movement. The next event is a discussion with Ken Budigan on the nonviolence of St. Francis and St. Clare. And with that, I'm going to turn it over, and I'm proud to turn it over to Father John. Welcome, Father John.
Thanks so much, Dave. And thank you very much for welcoming me. And I hope you all can hear me. And thank you, Noel and Father Joe and everyone at CASA for this beautiful Lenten program that you've put together. And I welcome everyone who's here. And I'm so glad you're here reflecting on peace and nonviolence during this Lent. I think it's the most important thing we can do. And it's what Lent is about. Actually, I think turning away from the culture of violence and turning toward the gospel vision of nonviolence. And so the 40 days are trying to practice nonviolence. And you want to accompany Jesus as he goes from the desert to the cross, to the empty tomb, which is a journey of nonviolence. I'm presuming most of the folks online are college students, and I thank you for being here and welcome you. Others friends may have heard me speak. I only saw one friend that I could recognize, and that's my friend Marie from Washington, D.C. Hello, Marie, if you're listening. I hope you're well. You've heard me say all this a million times, Marie, but nice to know that you're out there. Well, so what I want to do is I want to talk first about violence, and then I want to talk about nonviolence, and then I want to walk through the life of Jesus from the perspective, from the lens of nonviolence. Does that also sound all right, Dave? And Dave has given me 30 minutes, okay? So I'm just gonna jump right in on this evening as the world gets closer to war, as we're engaged in war, but I mean closer to nuclear war and just catastrophic destruction here on the night before Ash Wednesday, which is a day of repentance from systemic violence and our complicity in violence. So my first point, to say the obvious about violence, is we live in a world of total violence. And I really mean that. We are addicted to violence, war, and death itself. It's one big global pandemic of violence, one big global system of violence and structures and institutions of violence with the sole purpose of bringing death to the poor, to sisters and brothers, to the creatures, to the planet. And this infection of violence has touched every one of us. It's within us, it's in our relationships, it's violence against creatures and Mother Earth, and it takes all kinds of forms, from racism and sexism to gun violence and executions, to corporate greed and crushing poverty, to permanent warfare like we're seeing tonight with bombing of Kiev in Ukraine, to threatening to blow up the planet with nuclear weapons and destroying the environment and leading to catastrophic climate change. So I'm just saying the obvious, which nobody says, and we're not talking about. Violence is everywhere and in everyone. And what do we do about it? We practice more violence, which is total insanity. Violence in response to violence only leads to further violence. It's a never-ending downward spiral. War never brings peace, never. It never has. It always sows the seeds for future wars. So war is not the answer or the way to peace. It doesn't work. And it certainly, war doesn't build security or a better world or overcome evil or teach us how to be human, much less live a spiritual life, a godly life. You know, you can't be practicing war and be a war maker and claim to be following the peacemaking Jesus. I think that's an antithesis. So war and violence are a complete failure. If you want peace, which I think is what the four Gospels are all about, what God is all about, You have to renounce violence in all its forms and denounce the lie of war and the false spirituality of war and say things like, violence and war are not the will of God. Violence and war are never blessed by God. Violence and war are never justified. War is the definition of mortal sin. War is the demonic. That's what evil is. It's anti-human, anti-life, anti-democracy, anti-God, anti-Christ. It's illegal, but it's just downright impractical. So Jesus says at one point, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. That's violence leads to further violence. I would change that today to put those who live by the bomb and nuclear weapons will die by the bomb and nuclear weapons. You know, violence just leads to our own suffering of violence. You reap what you sow, the means or the end. What goes around comes around. And so here's the teaching. Peaceful means are the only way to a peaceful future and the God of peace, period. I think that's what the gospel said, and that's what all the great peacemakers and saints said, beginning with Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who used this very difficult, clumsy word, nonviolence. And that's what I want to talk about, because I think the words peace and love are so co-opted today. So now I want to just say a few words about nonviolence. To me, the only way forward then, the only response to this catastrophe, this global pandemic, this human addiction to violence and war is total nonviolence. Total nonviolence. That's what life and the spiritual life are all about. Martin Luther King said the night before he was killed, the choice is no longer violence or nonviolence. It's nonviolence or non-existence. And that's what we're seeing played out tonight, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere on the planet. So I really invite you, especially young people, to reflect on this clumsy word nonviolence, to define it and to practice it in your life. And for all of us to make Lent a time of turning away from our complicity in the culture of violence, turning toward the God of peace and nonviolence, and practicing gospel nonviolence like Jesus. This is a methodology which we can use to end violent conflict if we dare. And so we need to figure out how to become nonviolent people like Gandhi and Dr. King and Dorothy Day and so many great people, and work for a whole new culture of nonviolence and literally a whole new world of nonviolence. And it's totally doable. But that would include a new theology and spirituality of nonviolence. All my life, as some of you have been doing, I've been trying to figure nonviolence out and to define it. And you know, so here's some thoughts, some definitions about nonviolence. I think of it first as a vision of the heart that sees the whole human race as one, that all life is sacred, that we're all connected, that we're all sisters and brothers of every human being. We're all children of the God of peace, which means if you look at reality from the perspective of God, we're already one, already united, already reconciled, already brothers and sisters, which means you could never hurt anyone ever again, much less kill someone or be silent in the face of all these forms of violence like racism, poverty, war, nuclear weapons, destruction of the earth. So nonviolence is a tactic and a strategy, but it's also a way of life. And it's also a spiritual path. And it's also a methodology, really a political, economic, and social methodology of positive social change that always works when it's tried. It works through organized, bottom-up, people power, grassroots movements. That's how you change the world nonviolently. So nonviolence is not a utopian ideal or impractical or passive. It's very practical. It's the only realistic way forward, and it means action, changing your life and getting involved in the process, in the nonviolent process of changing the world. Now, Martin Luther King were here. He defined nonviolence as power. Isn't that fantastic? Nonviolence is power. He would say, we are not powerless. We have the power to change the world nonviolently if we want, if we organize and give our lives for nonviolent social change, just as millions of people give their lives for war. And you go, well, John, that's just impossible. No, it's not. We now know that there have been thousands of nonviolent movements in the last century that have affected billions of lives for the better. You just don't hear about it in the news. War is much more interesting, but it's nonviolent social change that's slow and active and grassroots where the real positive change is happening that's also spiritual. So nonviolence is organized love, active organized love in the pursuit of the truth of our common unity, which seeks justice, disarmament, and peace for the whole human race and all of creation, which means it stands up and publicly resists the structures and systems of violence and killing. And it persistently reconciles with every human being on the planet and all the creatures and Mother Earth. It allows the God of peace to disarm our hearts of the violence in us and to send us forth practicing unconditional, all-inclusive, non-retaliatory, all-encompassing, sacrificial, universal love for every human being on the planet and the creatures and Mother Earth. Isn't that fantastic? With one catch, as I always say, one big catch. And I invite everyone to take a deep breath and listen to this and think about it. There is no cause, however noble, no matter what anybody tells us ever again, for which you and I will ever support the taking of a single human life. No, we do not kill people anymore. We do not support the systems and nations that kill people anymore, no matter what they tell us. We give our lives to stop the killing of other people. We do not kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong. We work to end all the killings and the root causes of war and killing, and to educate every human being in nonviolence and nonviolent conflict resolution, and then to institutionalize nonviolence everywhere in the world and institutionalize nonviolent conflict resolution as the way forward in the world. Now, as some of you know, as I've been trying to figure all this out, a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Nonviolent Life. And there I proposed 3 simultaneous attributes for nonviolence. I'll just say them briefly. Like, you have to do all 3 to reach the nonviolence of the great heroes. So nonviolent requires, first, you have to really be nonviolent to yourself, which means not beat yourself up, not cultivate interior nonviolence, but try to make peace with yourself and create a space of peace inside you for the God of peace to live. And that's why we turn in meditation, to learn in meditation with God to let go of our anger and violence and hurts and wounds and resentments and bitterness. I can go on. Let go of all of that and let God give us the gift of peace. So how can you be more and more nonviolent to yourself? Second, at the same time, you want to practice meticulous interpersonal nonviolence toward every human being on the planet and all the creatures and Mother Earth. That's why this is so serious. You could say, yeah, I'm all for peace with people, but deep down, there are some people who really drive you crazy, who are really difficult, or you really would like to get back at with a little resentment. I'm just saying, maybe that seems to be the norm. So you want to work on that, and Lent's a really good time to work on practicing nonviolence with all the people around you. We're talking about being nonviolent to your spouse, your parents, your children, your brothers, your sisters, your neighbors, your friends, everybody in town, everybody in the workplace, everybody in the church, and an attitude of nonviolence toward every human being on the planet. So I invite you to reflect on who pushes your buttons, and to reflect that that person is your particular teacher of nonviolence because they're exposing your violence. And how are you going to become more nonviolent to them? And what about the creatures? And what about Mother Earth? How can we all become more and more nonviolent to Mother Earth? Okay, you're being nonviolent to yourself, nonviolent to all others. I'm trying to make 2. But there's a third thing you have to do at the same time. You have to have one foot in the global grassroots movement of nonviolence for positive social change. I like what Romero said. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everybody has to get involved in some issue for justice and peace to be part of the bottom-up grassroots people power movement for justice and disarmament and creation. So especially for young people, I say pick one cause, something that you have energy towards, and get involved and stay involved with a lot of love. You know, maybe it's with the homeless or the poor, maybe it's working to fight racism, or maybe gun violence, or maybe you want to work to end war and nuclear weapons, or maybe you're an environmental activist who really want to help resist catastrophic climate change and all that the work there is. Pick a cause and be part of the struggle. Now, why I'm saying all this is we're usually good at one of them, but very few people are good at this holistic nonviolence, which requires all three. Nonviolence to self, all others, and part of the movement. This is the way I see the life of Jesus from this lens of nonviolence, and that's what I want to talk about. So I always say that the scandal of the gospel is that Jesus was totally nonviolent. God is a God of total nonviolence. The gospel of Jesus calls us to be people of total nonviolence, like Gandhi and Dr. King and Dorothy Day. The church is supposed to be a global community of total nonviolence and of the followers of the nonviolent Jesus. How can I say it even more provocatively? If Jesus was violent, who cares about him? How does that help? You know, we don't need him. We're up to our ears in violence. Then he's another false Messiah. He's not saving us from violence. He's just another violent Messiah. And that's our problem. We've created a church of violence that worships a false God of violence, that teaches a false spirituality of violence, that upholds this baloney just war theory that has nothing to do with Jesus, and then supports holy nationalism and fundamentalism that leads to people blowing up the world and killing people for Jesus. I propose tonight and throughout the whole Lenten series for your reflection that the only thing we can say for sure about Jesus is that he's totally nonviolent. Isn't that powerful to think on that? Gandhi, I do this because Gandhi said that. Gandhi said that Jesus was the most active practitioner of nonviolence in the history of the whole world. And then poor Gandhi went on to say, and the only people on the whole planet who don't know that Jesus is nonviolent are Christians. It's just so sad. But you and I are trying to change that. And a lot is happening now in these recent years to wake up the churches toward nonviolence. So when Gandhi says Jesus is nonviolent, he means Jesus never hurt anyone, never supported hurting anyone or killing anyone. And then because he was nonviolent, he was not passive. So he was totally against the Roman Empire, which had killed millions of people, and the religious establishment, which is working for the empire to oppress people and bless their violence in the name of God. And so since he's not passive, he's practicing active nonviolence, and he builds a campaign and marches from Galilee to Jerusalem. I always say Jesus thinks he's Gandhi. Jesus thinks he's Dorothy Day and Dr. King, practicing nonviolence. I hope that gets a chuckle. But, if you go into Jerusalem on a campaign of nonviolence, you're going to be arrested and tortured and killed. And that's what happened to him. So I want to sum up his life with 10 points. And I might ask you a question or two along the way. But, basically, my question for you is, was Jesus totally nonviolent? What does that mean for us? How do we become people of total nonviolence? And how can we help the church and the whole human race become people of total nonviolence? That's the spiritual life. That's the journey of Lent. And that's the meaning of life as far as I figured out. Okay, here goes. Number one. He walks into the empire and announces the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel. So what's so powerful there is after every victory, when the Romans, like the Russians and the Americans, but in this case, we know the Roman troops would come into town and say, hey, we just killed everybody in the other town, and we're announcing the gospel of Caesar. It's good news. Jesus comes along and says, there's good news, a whole new gospel, the gospel of God. The days of violence and war and empire are over. The empire is falling. A new world of total nonviolence is at hand, the kingdom of God. And he went around proclaiming this. And to do it, to show it, he healed people, he expelled the demons that is being possessed by violence, and he formed a community of nonviolence. And everywhere he went, he's proclaiming the kingdom of God. What does that mean for us? Gandhi said he said, the kingdom of God is nonviolence. It's one of the most amazing sentences ever. So if that's true, what you and I want to do for the rest of our lives, like as followers of the nonviolent Jesus, is say, from now on, we are announcing the coming of a new world of nonviolence. We are announcing the abolition of war and poverty and racism and sexism and gun violence, executions, permanent warfare, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction. All of that's over with. Second, his teachings. All of the teachings of Jesus are a call to total nonviolence. Love one another, love your neighbors, show compassion to everyone, seek justice for the poor, forgive everyone, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Take up the cross, lay down your life in love for humanity. If you get my book on the Sermon on the Mount called The Beatitudes of Peace, or you listen to I have a lot of free podcasts at my group, beatitudecenter.org. You see that I focus a lot on the Sermon on the Mount, which Gandhi called the greatest teachings of nonviolence in history. And he read from them every day for the last 45 years of his life. And he's not a Christian. He read from Matthew 5. That was his great book of teaching. And there you'll read, I'll look at 3 or 4 commandments. Blessed are the peacemakers. They will be called the sons and daughters of the God of peace. So there's the invitation right at the start to become peacemakers in a world of total violence and warfare and empire. That's what we're called to do, which means we're called not to be war makers, not to join the military, but to resist the military and do everything we can to end wars. Why? Because we're sons and daughters of the God of peace. What does that mean? God is not a God of war, but a peacemaker. God is totally nonviolent. This is that spirituality. Do you believe in a God of peace and nonviolence? Or don't you think that God is violent and can't wait to throw you into hell, or somebody? Let's hope God throws somebody in hell. No, that's not the teaching. God's not like that. It goes on, and I can talk all night, as I have, about the Sermon on the Mount, but I'll just point out that there's 6 antitheses. Let me look at the last 2. You have heard it said, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, and this is the best translation, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. There's the commandment. Someone's going to do violence to you, you're not allowed to do violence back. Period. Case closed. That's the commandment. So the world has always said, someone's going to do violence to you, you do violence back to them, or you run away and do nothing. Jesus comes with the third way, third option. You don't run away, you're not passive, but you engage in active, creative, nonviolent resistance, but you don't use the means of your opponent. You see, that's the difference. You are even willing to accept suffering without retaliation in a spirit of love till the scales fall from your opponent and he or she recognizes our common humanity and we move towards reconciliation. Now, Gandhi proved that this methodology of nonviolent resistance, which Jesus explains in the Sermon on the Mount, he gives all these examples, beginning with the turn the other cheek, that this methodology of nonviolent resistance can work on a national level. And it's happened many times since the life of Gandhi. And I'm just going to come out and say, this is what Ukraine should do. I look at the war tonight and see Christians killing Christians. And none of us are following the nonviolent Jesus. None of us are obeying the teachings of Sermon on the Mount like the Hindu Gandhi did. What should they do? Oh, Russia's going to invade you. You surrender. And then you practice total nonviolent non-cooperation until the Russians leave as brothers and sisters. And you go, John, that's impossible. You haven't done your homework. You've got to read how it was tried. It's just rarely tried. Where it was tried against the Nazis, it worked. Denmark, Bulgaria, Norway. Go and study them. But that's not even the climax in the Sermon on the Mount. Then he says, you have heard it said, love your countrymen and hate your enemies. But I say, love your enemies and pray for your persecutors, and then you will be sons and daughters of the God who lets the sun rise on the good and the bad, and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. So again, here is a call to universal love. And why? Because that's what God does. God practices universal nonviolent love. So my question again for you is, who is your God? Is your God a God of peace and universal love? Do you believe in a God of nonviolence? Do you believe in Jesus? And if you do, then you have to reflect that in your image of God. How do you love your enemies? Notice he's not talking about a difficult person in your life. He's talking about the people who are being targeted for death by your nation state. And notice he doesn't say, however, if they're really bad, bomb the hell out of them. There's no just war theory here. Okay, third, after all these teachings, he organizes a campaign of nonviolence, like Gandhi on the Salt March or Dr. King going into Birmingham. And he gets 72 followers, and he says, I'm sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. That's the definition of the Christian. Think about it. Have you ever seen a little lamb? Have you ever seen a wolf? Imagine a little lamb surrounded by, say, 100 wolves. That's Jesus's image of you and me. So you and I don't want to be wolves. We don't want to be lambs or sheep in wolves' clothing, or I get it back, or wolves in sheep's clothing. No, we want to be totally disarmed and innocent and nonviolent as lambs, building a movement, going into the culture of violence and saying, no more violence, the reign of God is at hand. That's the job description of the Christian. Fourth, he gets close to Jerusalem. So he's on this campaign. That's what the four Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all about. And as he gets to Jerusalem, he sees the city and breaks down sobbing and says, if today you had only understood the things that make for peace. You can see that Jerusalem, as you know, was totally destroyed in the year 70. You're all going to be destroyed because you're all relying on violence and not accepting my wisdom of nonviolence. Unfortunately, we're no different than they were. And now Jerusalem has become the whole world, and we're on the brink of nuclear war and total environmental destruction. And Jesus is still breaking down sobbing because we haven't, and we refuse to learn the things that make for peace. So this Lent, I invite you to think, what are the things that make for peace? Well, he outlined them in the Sermon on the Mount. Do you want to learn the things that make for peace? Go and learn them and teach them, and meanwhile grieve with Jesus over the insanity of war. Fifth, he walks into the temple. Now, the temple in Jerusalem is the center of injustice, where the religious authorities work with the imperial forces to, in effect, steal all the money of the people in the name of God. You know, they believed that God only existed in the temple, and the only way to see God was you got to pay your life savings. And they had money changers and a banking system. And Jesus walks in an act of nonviolent civil disobedience, turns over the tables and says, no more injustice. This is a house of prayer. He doesn't hurt anybody, kill anybody, bomb anybody, but he's not passive. He takes nonviolent direct action and accepts the consequences. And because of that illegal action, he's arrested and killed a few days later. And it's why I've committed civil disobedience. I've been arrested over 80 times and working for justice and peace, trying to be as nonviolent as possible. I don't see Jesus blowing up and getting angry here. He's very gentle. If anything, he's grieving. He just broke down sobbing, but he's not going to just let it happen. He's going to take action for justice and peace. Well, if we're going to be disciples of him, what public nonviolent action are we willing to take? You know, if he was upset about the temple, what would he say about the Pentagon? Or our nuclear weapons installations, or our plans to destroy Mother Earth? 6, it's now Passover. They're in the upper room. He takes the bread and the cup, and he says, my body broken for you, my blood shed for you. Okay, we've heard it maybe a million times. What should he have said if he was a good Roman or a good American? He should have said, Go break their bodies for me. Go shed their blood for me. That's what Hitler says. That's what all our war-making president says. That's what Putin says. That's what Zelensky's saying. Everybody's saying, not Jesus. My body broken for you. My blood shed for you. Do this. So when you enter into Eucharist, if you go to church and go to communion, receive the body and blood of Christ, you are entering to the methodology of social change of Jesus, the new covenant of nonviolence. So how do you feel about that? And how much do you want to do that with the nonviolent Jesus? 7, he's in Gethsemane. Here come the horrible Roman soldiers, and they're about to arrest him. And Peter thinks, they're going to arrest our guy. We can't let this happen. We've got to protect the Holy One. And he's thinking, if there's ever a just war in all of history, if violence is ever allowed, it's here in this moment. We have to kill to protect Jesus. And he's right. And just as Peter takes up the sword to go and kill and protect Jesus, the commandment comes down, put down the sword. Dear friends, these are the last words of Jesus to the church, to the men and women, his friends, his community around him. And I think it's the first time Peter and his friends understood who Jesus is and how serious he is about all this love and compassion and peace stuff, that Jesus is totally nonviolent. And he's not going to defend himself with violence, and neither are we allowed to. And so what do? They all run away. And that just leaves me to my last point. So I'll wrap it up here because I've gone too long. He goes to his death. He's executed, he's arrested and brutally tortured and executed. But as Gandhi says, Jesus goes to his death in perfect nonviolence. He doesn't even get angry at anybody. But he says, in effect, the violence stops here in my body. You are all forgiven, but from now on, you're not allowed to kill. And so I always say, Jesus teaches us not how to kill, He teaches us how to love, how to make peace, how to be compassionate, how to be nonviolent, how to forgive, how to pray, how to suffer and die well, not how to kill, not how to wage war, not how to make money, not how to be afraid, and not how to support empire. So we Christians are followers of Jesus who walk with him on the way of the cross, which is the way of nonviolence and resistance to empire, even to the point of giving our lives nonviolently for others, especially for the poor and oppressed. And that leads to my last point, the resurrection. I'll just end with this. If Jesus's execution was totally legal, his resurrection was totally illegal. And his total, perfect, nonviolent revolution. I think the only way to understand resurrection, as the only way to understand Jesus, and the only way to understand the gospel, and the only way to understand anything in his teachings, is from the lens of nonviolence. So resurrection means having nothing to do with death. And therefore, not having a trace of violence within you or complicity with the culture of death and the infliction of death upon other human beings, which means resurrection means total nonviolence. Now, Jesus comes back after we killed him, and he's still nonviolent. He makes breakfast for his friends. He says, peace be with you. He breathes the gift of peace upon him and says, now you go forward and walk the journey of nonviolence into the world of violence and continue my mission of resisting the structures of violence and working for a new culture of nonviolence. And because of his resurrection, we now know that death does not get the last word, that war and empire are not all and powerful, that nonviolence does work, that our survival is already guaranteed, and that total nonviolence is the way forward, that Jesus was right. My hope and prayer this Lent for all of you is that you will help more and more people turn away, starting tomorrow on Ash Wednesday, from the culture of violence and war and death. And then we renounce it and publicly campaign against it. and that we might turn to the nonviolent Jesus and embrace the gospel teachings of nonviolence and do our part to build up a global grassroots movement of nonviolence for justice, disarmament, for a new world of nonviolence, and for the protection of the creatures and Mother Earth. Thank you, everybody, for listening to me.
Father John, thank you so much for that. You gave plenty to think about for the rest of Lent. We can reflect on your words. And I especially appreciate the call to action, because it's not just a matter of listening and reading about nonviolence, but it's about taking action. And like Dorothy Day once said, there's no time for despair or discouragement. There's too much work to do. We've got a number of questions, and I welcome anybody else to use the chat function to send in some questions. We'll start off with this. Okay, here's a question. Was Jesus angry when he upset the table in the temple, or was he just being a nonviolent activist?
So thank you for that question. And I've been asked it all my life, and I studied it in theology school 30 years ago, before you were all born. In the Greek, the word anger is only, it only says Jesus was angry twice in the 4 Gospels. Did you know that, Dave?
No.
Yeah, so we say, oh, well, he must have been a raging lunatic. No, he was angry in Mark chapter 3, when he's in the synagogue in Galilee, and he sees the poor man in the back with the withered hand. And he calls the guy come up and says, stand right here. He doesn't heal the guy. He makes the poor guy with the withered hand and stand in front of all the devout people. And then Jesus asks this shocking question. Is it better to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? To save life or destroy life? What? And they want to kill him. And most of the translations say he was angry and said to the man, stretch out your hand. But actually, it's not anger. Can you hear me, Dave?
Yes.
Yeah. If you read it in the Greek, it's something more like he was so upset and perturbed that he heals the man. Like, how can you people be so cold-hearted? I think there's a difference with the word anger. Boy, people are not going to like this, but I've been studying about it all my life. And this is something I've talked a lot about with Archbishop Tutu, who was not a man of anger, but was a man of great passion. That's why I believe there's another way in the nonviolent way. In the raising of Lazarus, it says he approaches the tomb and they said, where is he? He says, where is he? And they say, come and see. And he breaks down sobbing. And it says he's angry, but again, the word in Greek is he was so upset because they were all mourning and happy about death. He's not. He says, I'm glad I wasn't there. And he calls Lazarus out of the tomb. I wrote a whole book on this if people want to pursue it, called Lazarus Come Forward. Now, I say this because in the Sermon on the Mount, it says, you have heard it said, thou shalt not kill. I say to you, do not even get angry. And he says, instead, go and be reconciled with everybody you've heard. Now, having said that as the ground rules, I've studied this appearance in the temple where he turns over the tables, happens in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the culmination. He marches to Jerusalem, he turns over the tables in civil disobedience, and he's arrested and killed. John's gospel, written 50 years later, moves that whole story up to the beginning of the gospel, so it's a very different scene. None of them say he was angry. Now, I've been arrested, as I said, many times, and I don't go and get arrested getting angry. If you do that, you're going to get shot and killed. You have to be really nonviolent and peaceful. Every time I've been arrested, it's been an experience of prayer. You're like Thich Nhat Hanh and Mahatma Gandhi. So if you see footage of Gandhi getting arrested, or Dr. King, or Dorothy Day, they're very gentle and quiet and peaceful. That's the way Jesus would have been. But most people, we use this to justify violence. So you have the painting in the year 1500 of El Greco, he has the picture of Jesus with the whip in the temple, and the whip is 40 yards long, and he's whipping all these women in long dresses. It was nothing like that. There were no women in long dresses because women are not allowed in there, first of all. You know, it's just the men. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention anything about a whip. But the Gospel of John has that one word which has caused a lot of harm. But the temple is 5 stories tall. They would have brought in thousands of doves and thousands of lambs to kill all of them, to worship God. But you had to pay to do that. And because you're so all horrible people, we have to tax you so you can use our holy money. So you're going to have to pay even more. So they're slaughtering lambs all over the place, and even some cattle and oxen. Well, to get all those thousands of animals 5 stories up into the temple, are you with me? Required a very specific kind of rope. In the Greek, that word, it says Jesus took a piece of rope and expelled them all from the temple. Well, that rope is a kind of hemp. I studied this in grad school. It's the only word where that time that word is mentioned. And that kind of hemp only existed, 2,000 years ago. And that's what the cattle drivers and the lamb owners used to get the animals up into the building. So Jesus took that, and he doesn't whip the people, he's leading the animals out. So not only is he not angry, and not only is he saving us from the injustice, I consider Jesus an animal rights activist who saved the lives of thousands of animals who were about to be killed in the temple. What do you think of that, David? There's no anger. It's actually dramatic nonviolent action, just like the Berrigans at Catonsville, or Dorothy when she refused to go underground during the nuclear air raid drills, and all of us who do civil disobedience. That's hopeful to me. That gives me hope. And he brought down the whole temple and justice system. He gave his life for it, but that's the methodology that we have to be about, in my opinion.
All right, here's a question, Father John, from a college student. And the question is, what should a grassroots project look like on a college campus with so many different perspectives and backgrounds?
That is such a great question. Well, as with everything, I say, go and pray about it. So go ask God, what do you want me to do? I'm here in college. What should I do? Then go get a group of friends. You can never do anything alone. And talk about that. Well, what's going on in your college? What needs some changing? Whether it's about racism, or maybe there's the military recruiting on campus, or maybe they're building nuclear weapons like they do, for example, at UC Berkeley. Or maybe they're investing in oil companies and fossil fuels. And a lot of college kids, beginning with Harvard, organized to get their universities to no longer invest in fossil fuels. So you have to have a small group, and you got to start meeting, I would say, for an hour or two once a week. That's what my friend Dr. Paul Farmer and I did way back when in Duke, my friend who just died. And then you talk about things, and then you organize a vigil, and people are going to get mad. Now you get to talk about it, and get into the student newspaper and say, we don't support bombing, or we don't support investment in fossil fuels, or we want to do our own Black Lives Matter rally here. There's so much to do. Anti-gun violence, anti-executions. It depends where you live. There are college groups all over the country with students doing good things, and they make a difference. Experiment with nonviolence. Don't take my word. And what I want you to take the word of Jesus and to know about it, but then the only way, go and see if it works. And I did that in I've done it all my life, and I can just tell you it works. All kinds of miracles happened. I was once in graduate school getting a master's in philosophy at Fordham in the early 80s, and the CIA came to recruit. And so we organized 100 students, and 10 of them sat in and blocked him from going in the building. There were 100 other college kids who wanted to come and join the CIA. And because we did a sit-in, he said, the CIA is never coming back to Fordham. Well, we had parties for weeks afterwards, and we just thought anything is possible. And I think it's true.
John, you already talked a little bit about this, but we've gotten a number of questions about Ukraine.
Yeah.
One person asking, isn't self-defense justified on the part of the Ukrainians? Another person is asking, how can Ukrainians practice nonviolence in order to resolve the violence coming at them from Putin and the Russians? I mean, I think it's kind of crucial. This is such a good teaching moment. Maybe elaborate a little bit more what a nonviolent response would have been or could still be for the Ukrainians.
Sure. Well, so self-defense, of course, is justified, but not violent self-defense if you're a Christian. This Jesus guy who's breaking the rifle here, you know, he was killed. He defended himself non-violently. He didn't want to be killed. He wanted everybody to be converted. And he was not passive. He took action. So that's and he commands us to offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. So we're talking about nonviolent self-defense. Everybody on the planet has to start teaching one another nonviolent conflict resolution, nonviolent self-defense, and so forth. That's what Gandhi and Dr. King were trying to teach us. Now, there have been many books and many scholars showing how to do this, when it's happened, when it was happened, and how it worked. I mentioned against the Nazis, even Denmark, Bulgaria, and Norway. Very few people were killed in that country because what happens is, you look at the story of Denmark, for example, the Nazis roll in on a Wednesday morning into Denmark, and they say, okay, now everybody, we are all part of Nazi Germany. And we order every Jew to be wearing the Star of David on their arm. That afternoon at 1 o'clock, the king in Copenhagen appeared on the balcony wearing the Star of David on his arm and said, let's all wear the Star of David. We're all Jews in Denmark. And we're all going to non-violently, non-cooperate and resist the Nazis. And the Nazis don't know how to respond. Non-violence, everybody knows how to respond with violence because we're all violent, but they were just flabbergasted. And what do? Just open fire and kill everybody? That generally doesn't happen. I think there were 126 people who were killed in Norway. They did a similar thing, and it was mainly the teachers. Anyway, you see the point. Well, you're going, I mean, the people of Ukraine should have been organizing nonviolent resistance for decades. In fact, they have. They had a previous, the Ukrainian revolution was by and large nonviolent. The Latvian revolution was nonviolent. The Estonian revolution is just so incredible. They use singing as a tactic for their nonviolent movement toward independence. Now, right now, there are thousands of people in the Ukraine who espouse nonviolence and peace. We know that because a lot of the groups in the US are in solidarity with them. And one of them brought on a young leader for the Ukrainian movement of nonviolence, and he was on Democracy Now! Last week, which is a program that I like. I appeared on it recently, and that you get an alternative view of the news. The mainstream media is never going to tell you about people who care about peace because CNN wants to get money out of for war. They get really rich about reporting on war, and people are making a lot of money on this. And nonviolence is long-term organizing and long-term training. And we don't know tonight what's going on the ground about how people are doing that there. Well, you and I may personally not make a big difference there, but we can make a big difference here in the United States where we live. Well, what would that mean? That would mean not joining the military, doing your homework and learning nonviolence, study Gandhi and all the great books about nonviolent resistance. Bring somebody into your campus to do a nonviolence training and to give lectures about nonviolent alternatives to war. Study all the peace and nonviolence groups and all the many reports that they're putting out today, from wagingnonviolence.org to my friends at Pace Bene, Pax Christi, Meta Center for Nonviolence, and so forth. And get with the movement that's working to promote nonviolence alternatives and trying to build up nonviolent conflict resolution at every level, in the local grassroots level in your communities and cities, but even at the UN level. And that's our job. That's the spiritual life. That's what God calls us to do. The rest is all baloney. It's really hard. And this is why you need God, and you need a friends, and you need to get with the movement, and you can't do it alone. But miracles happen, and if you don't believe me, look at the fall of the Berlin Wall nonviolently, the fall of communism, the end of apartheid through nonviolent grassroots movements. I mean, the election of Mandela, incredible. The getting of the dictator Marcos to leave the Philippines in 3 days in 1985. And there have been 100 nonviolent revolutions. It's amazing. And the only reason we haven't had nuclear weapons right now is because of the organizing and people speaking out. And that's what we have to keep doing. Everybody is needed. If you're sitting back and watching CNN and just feeling despairing and depressed, you're not following Jesus. You're just being a passive person of despair. Then you're the problem. You're the problem. Your silence is complicity in the culture of war. No, get with the program, get with some grassroots movement, join the peace groups, environmental groups, and disarmament and justice groups. And it means going to meetings, and it means making phone calls and writing letters and putting pressure and organizing demonstrations and doing that for the rest of your life. But I can promise, especially to college students, it's the most meaningful thing we can do with our lives, to know that our lives have made a difference, not just to bring justice to the poor, but actually to help end war and prevent nuclear war and stop the destruction of Mother Earth and the creatures. Well, Dave, I can go on, but maybe that's something there.
Yeah, excellent. I think what we'll do is take a few moments to take maybe a minute and a half break. We'll allow the groups, the college groups and that gathered for a discussion to break away from this presentation and begin their local discussion. Noel, if you want to put up those questions that Father John had presented for discussion, and we will return in about 90 seconds. We have more questions if you want to stay on. Thank you. Seconds. All right, I think we can return to the question and answers. We've got some questions for you, Father John. Did you get a chance, this is one question, did you get a chance to study Archbishop Wester's pastoral letter on nuclear disarmament? Can you tell us a little bit about it, and what impact might it have on other American bishops? I
urge everybody who's listening to read it. It's free online at the website of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. We've never had a pastoral letter in the United States ever like this, calling for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. It's addressed to the people of New Mexico, which is the birthplace of the bomb, but also to the church in the United States and the world. It's absolutely beautiful. And we had a little committee working on it with him. And he could get in a lot of trouble. He hasn't yet, but we're expecting a lot of pushback. But it's had a very positive experience. 2 weeks ago, it was excerpted in Time magazine. I spoke about it on Democracy Now! There have been 5 articles about it in NCR. I have not been able to get the Times or the Washington Post to write about it, but I keep working. And he has just been invited on a national speaking tour of Japan, which would be very hopeful because he would then meet with the bishops of Japan and present a letter expressing not only sorrow for what the United States did in Japan, which was totally unnecessary, the war was going to end anyway, and calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. That would be real, genuine peacemaking, really, really historic. We just mailed off copies to the Pope and the Vatican, so they haven't technically seen it, even though other friends and I have reached out to the Vatican. But it's very exciting. And as you may know, Pax Christi is having their first National Assembly in many years in Washington, D.C. on Hiroshima Day weekend. Archbishop Wester is giving the keynote speech that Friday night.
Question, do you think that the just war theory will ever be officially rejected by the church?
It's almost been. It has almost been in I can never speak the Latin. In one of the Pope Francis' recent documents, but I don't see that Marie Dennis is still on. She's the leader of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, who organized the historic meeting in the Vatican in April 2016 that many of us were at, and which led to Pope Francis's writing the first statement on nonviolence in the history of the world. First statement on nonviolence, the January 1st, 2017 World Day of Peace message called Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. At the conference, the Vatican joined us in a statement saying, and I quote, "There is no such thing as a just war. There never was. But it certainly can't, the 7 conditions or whatever they are, actually nobody knows. They can't be applied because in every war now, you begin by killing civilians. That's what's happening tonight in Kiev. Civilians are being killed. And you can't have proportionality, or it says you have to exhaust every possible means at resolving the conflict. Well, that never happens. Ukraine, they can go on and on. Russia didn't need to do this. So I could go on and on. Yes, I think Pope Francis is making massive changes that are not being reported. He's absolutely outlawed any little exception about the death penalty. Thanks to Sister Helen Prejean, Pope Francis did that. He's the first one talking about nonviolence. And then there's been this massive paradigm shift, absolutely outlawing even the possession of nuclear weapons, not just the use of them or deterrence. That's never happened before. He's gone so much farther than John Paul II. And that's why Archbishop Wester's letter is possible, is because he's just quoting Pope Francis. Nobody else is in the United States or around the world. Well, a lot of people are around the world, just not in the United States and Russia. What we're trying to do under Marie Dennis's leadership is get Pope Francis to write an encyclical on peace and nonviolence, where he will say there is no more just war theory. Jesus says, love your enemies. He doesn't say, okay, under these conditions, you can kill them. He just doesn't say that. Jesus is a person of total nonviolence. We're hopeful that Pope Francis will do that. I'm hoping he will do that. I've been pushing on that for years now. Personally. And I think we're very close. I mean, in some ways you could say the Vatican has already said it, but what we need is an encyclical. So that's what we're working on. And if people are interested in this, go look up Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, Google it, and you'll be taken to a website somewhere. It might be connected to Pax Christi International. You're going to see tons of stuff about it. And you want to get involved, get involved. We need everybody's help. Dave, I'm just chatting away here and I could go on till about midnight if you don't interrupt me.
Well, listen, a couple more questions. And this one you might have to explain a little bit to us. What about the doctrine of discovery? Can the Pope revoke that and the violence that is caused against indigenous peoples?
Well, why don't you tell people what it means and I'll try to answer that.
Well, you know what, be honest with you, I am just reading this question.
Okay, well, everybody needs to know about it. It basically said, the Catholic Church said, yeah, all you Spaniards and Italians, all those you are going into the Americas to claim the new world for Christ. You know, you have the right to do that. Do whatever you need for God, for Christ, and for the Catholic Church. Well, they committed genocide and they killed up to 15 million people. And the document is called the Document of Discovery. You have the moral right to do whatever you need to do to claim the new world for Jesus. Baloney. And so it was really, you know, as in all religious blessing of war and violence, it led to terrible things. It made the colonialists and imperialists empowered. Yes, it's still being used, but more and more people are waking up about it. Now, I have heard, you know, they've had a number of sessions at the Vatican about it. Francis there, and he said they're renouncing it. But again, what does that mean? I think an encyclical on peace and nonviolence would really help, where Francis just outlines all of this, because Laudato Si is very clear about the environment and has changed the world. And we keep telling Francis, we need an encyclical, which is equal to the Vatican II, which says, no war, no just war, no nuclear weapons, no executions, no gun violence, no racism, no doctrine of discovery, no more empire, no more killing for Jesus. Those days are over. And from now on, we're going to live and practice the Sermon on the Mount, be practitioners of nonviolence. So unfortunately, Dave, that's just one small incidence of the church's long legacy of violence. And that needs to be addressed. And how do we do that? Again, in the Vatican, where Marie goes every couple of months, there have been massive shift, even since I started going there. It's very hopeful. That's never happened before in history since the early church. So they're not only way beyond the just war theory, way beyond nukes, and way beyond the doctrine of discovery, they're really waking up to the kinds of things I was talking about, that to be a Catholic now is to practice gospel nonviolence. I actually feel very hopeful.
Mm-hmm. John, maybe a final question that you can kind of reflect on for us. We've lost a lot of wonderful, amazing leaders in the past year, peace leaders, Catholic worker leaders. You've lost friends that have been connected to the movement. Do you want to just maybe highlight a couple of the amazing people that we've lost and what it is they left to us, what we could learn from them?
Well, sure, I'll talk about 4 of them. I've actually had 10 friends die since Christmas, and good friends. And I know so many people, but so forgive me for name dropping, but 2 of them would be Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Thich Nhat Hanh. Now, I recorded a long segment with Amy Goodman for Democracy Now! About them. If you haven't seen it and you'd like to, I encourage you to. It's go to democracynow.org. Then you look on the website, and at the very top, over the news of the day, it says web exclusives, and you click on that, and you then can see that my 30-minute talk on Tutu and Thich Nhat Hanh. So I knew Archbishop Tutu for 25 years. We emailed every other week for 15 years, and he nominated me for the Nobel Peace Prize. I'll just say he was a lot of fun and really strong and passionate. He was really silly and funny. And instead of being angry, he cried. And I tell that story on Democracy Now! If you want to hear the full thing. The last time I saw him in South Africa, he grabbed me by the collar and said, "John, you and I have to work for peace and justice every day till the day we die." And being a smart aleck and a pretty good friend, close friend of his, I said, "Oh, come on, man, how do I do that?" And I hit him in the chest and said, "How do you do that, Tutu?" And he got real close to me and he burst into tears. And he said, "I cry." And this is this business about Jesus and grief. "I've cried every day of my life because human beings have rejected Jesus's way of peace and nonviolence." And then he got himself together and he started to laugh. And he says, "I have laughed every day of my life." And then he bursts into laughter and starts making fun of me, which, hey, who do you think you are? And he just said, "Looking at you, you're ridiculous. Who do you think you are? You're the most ridiculous person I know." And he told me that a lot. And that makes me laugh. And we started laughing. He was making fun of me. Oh, it was a lot of fun. And he was changing the world, by the way. And he'd been under death threat since he was 13 years old. And here he is crying and laughing. He's not a raging lunatic. And he should be. He was head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which meant he had to hear all the stories about how the white racists tortured and killed Black South Africans. He should be insane, but he figured out another way of nonviolence. Thich Nhat Hanh, again, I knew him for 25 years, and he should be insane because he personally knew 1,000 people killed in Vietnam. But he was exiled and moved to France, and I got to know him as the head of the Fellowship of Reconciliation through my friendship with Daniel Berrigan. And as I always say, well, for me, I learned from him. I really encourage you to learn from him the personal practice of peace, which for him meant living in the present moment of peace, concentrating on your breath, breathing in peace, breathing out peace. And so practicing mindfulness and nonviolence. Now, I saw him do that. I knew how he did that. But I just consider that Christian nonviolence. It's being with the risen Jesus, breathing in the spirit of peace. And I told him so. And the second thing was look deeply within. That was a big Thich Nhat Hanh teaching. Don't beat yourself up, but look within. Why did I do that? Why was I so mean the other day? Why do I want to run through that red light and run that person over? You know, whatever is going on, just look deeply within and try to move from violence to nonviolence. And third, as we keep practicing mindfulness in the present moment of peace, I think then we learn, like from Thich Nhat Hanh, to become more like Jesus, people of universal love, universal compassion, universal peace, and total nonviolence. Jim Forrest was my good friend from the Catholic Worker. I flew to Amsterdam a few years ago to help him write the biography of Daniel Berrigan, who was my close friend. But I've known Jim for 40 years. He'd been very sick, and he was a great teacher of peace and nonviolence, and that's what we can all learn to do from him. And the Catholic Workers should be a voice for peace and nonviolence, always. Dorothy and Peter were. And lastly, my friend, Dr. Paul Farmer, who just died last week. I don't know if people are familiar with him, but his death was on the front page of the New York Times and every paper in the world. He found, and we went to college together. We lived in the same fraternity for 3 years, and then we've been friends for our whole lives since we were 17 years old, and we're both 62. And he died in Rwanda last week. They found him in the morning. He died in his sleep, leaving his wife and kids behind. He founded Partners in Health, which is 20,000 doctors and healthcare workers working in 10 countries. He saved the lives of millions of people. He built 3 or 4 hospitals and 2 or 3 universities and was a peacemaker through healing. And there's a great Netflix movie out about him right now that I highly recommend called Bending the Arc. Bending the Arc. If you all want to see my friend, go and watch that movie or Google him and read up about him. And you could read my big reflection about him at americamagazine.org that was published last week. So Dave, thank you very much. That's an awful lot. I could go on and on. I hope this was helpful for what you had in mind. And since everybody's, signed off, I can't see people, but I hope everybody it was helpful. And let's go forward and have a really great series. And you start Ash Wednesday with repenting from violence and our complicity in the culture of violence. And let's make Lent a journey of nonviolence, following the nonviolent Jesus all the way to the cross, whatever that means for each of us. Wonderful way to look at Lent.
Well, thank you so much, Father John. Wonderful. And thank you for starting off our series and setting the tone and the direction. Again, I want to recommend the beatitudecenter.org, Father John's website and project. Again, you can listen to podcasts, you can sign up for great events. That's all if you want to really dig deeper into nonviolence. And next week, we want to welcome everybody back. We have Dan Moriarty from Maryknoll Office of Global Concerns, and Tanya Avila Meneses. She's a Bolivian theologian who attended the Amazon Synod in the Vatican a couple of years ago. And it'd be wonderful. Dan worked for about 17 years as a lay missioner in Bolivia and worked with her there. So we welcome you back to that next Tuesday night, 7 p.m. and continue coming for the rest of the events. Thank you, everybody. Good night and God bless.
Be well, everybody. God bless you. Blessed Lent. Bye-bye.